Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of musicians who have influenced the whole scape of music since the year 1930. The first musician we'll be covering in this series is Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson was born in 1911 to Julia Dodds and Noah Johnson in Hazelhurst, Mississippi. He had 10 siblings and attended the Tunica Indian Creek School. And throughout his childhood, he lived in various different places. He was born in Hazelhurst, but when he was only 2, he was already moved to Memphis and Arkansas at 9 years old. Throughout the rest of his life, he remained a transient figure, going from place to place in quite nomadic fashion. It's actually how he started his career in guitar and music in general, as he played for tips on street corners and outside barber shops and bars. He actually drifted away from playing typical blues and often took requests playing many of the famous pop songs of the times. His uncanny skill for picking up music by ear made him stand out and often earned him a good chunk of change to sustain himself. Few is known about Robert Johnson, as he was an obscure figure and he lived so long ago. But some of the key parts of his personality were that he was a transient lover. He had a woman in every town he visited. And he indulged in many different relationships and marriages, and had quite a few children. As for his discography, Robert Johnson actually didn't record any albums, as at the time, albums were definitely not popular, and it might not have been physically possible for them to even be made. However, he recorded a few different singles with Don Law in 2 different studios. The first at the Gunter Hotel in San Antonio, and the second in Dallas at the Vitagraph Studios. These recordings later turned out to be The King of Delta Blues, 1, released in 1936, and 2, released in 1937. And the same material was on the complete recordings, released as a compilation album in 1990. As a listener, that's probably the one I recommend you going out and listening to, as they've been a little bit cleaned up, and it's just a nice place to find his complete body of work, rather than bits and pieces of different takes. Between the 2 sessions, he recorded 29 songs, and was one of the first artists who chose to maximize the 3 minutes of the 78 RPM side of singles at the time. Out of all the singles recorded, I recommend listening to I Believe I'll Dust My Room, as the production sounds really good on this one compared to the others, and it does a really great job setting an atmosphere personal to the listener. Next, I would probably recommend Traveling Riverside Blues, as you could hear his piercing vocals at their fullest extent, and it has a beautiful rustic feel that I think a lot of the other tracks lack in their similarity in the blues. Furthermore, I think 3220 Blues is a classic, being a predecessor to Hey Joe in meaning, but lacking some of the substance that song contains. However, about around a minute and a half in that song, he speeds up and does this cool vocal effect, and has a beautiful melodic second half. Lastly, I'd recommend Sweet Home Chicago. This is probably one of his most famous songs, and it's a nice hometown song, despite Chicago not residing in California. However, he could have just been referring to Port Chicago, which actually is in California, and it is rumored that he used to go up there to visit family. So I think those are the essential listens off the albums, and of all the recordings. There were a lot of myths that surrounded Robert Johnson, as probably the most famous one being that he learned to play guitar very well and very diligently from the devil. The myth is well famous in rock and roll, and is quite infamous with just the narrative that rock and roll is the devil's music. The story goes is that in the Dockery Plantation crossroad at midnight, Robert Johnson was confronted by a giant, shadowy black figure, who is also called the devil by many, who then went on to ask him for his guitar, proceeded to tune it, play a couple songs, and returned it back to him. In the same process, it is said that Robert Johnson also acquired a great amount of skills in an almost impossibly short amount of time. While this myth has been almost affirmed by a few people, it actually has little concrete evidence, as many of his closest family members and friends haven't confirmed nor even talked to media about Robert. And it is much more likely that he just played in a graveyard a lot, practicing like his mentors and idols like Zimmerman. However, different accounts of these stories exist, and it's up to the interpretation, so you could choose to perceive it however you'd like. Robert Johnson died on August 16th, 1938, at the age of 27, becoming the first member of the ever-famous 27 Club. Many different causes of death have been cited, and I'll take you through a couple of them, slowly building up to the one which I think is most valid. Before I do, though, I must mention that Robert Johnson had many different diseases and ailments in his life that could have contributed greatly to his degradation and degeneration of his health, especially considering his transient lifestyle probably wasn't healthy for him at the time. The first possible way of death would be congenital syphilis. Being a regular womanizer, it would not have been surprising if Robert Johnson contracted this disease. However, it doesn't have much validity, and most people choose not to acknowledge this theory. Most other people tend to think that he was murdered by a jealous husband of a woman he once flirted with. The way in which he was murdered remains vague, as some say he had poisoned whiskey with strychnine, although this claim has been somewhat refuted, because strychnine apparently has a fragrant and putrid odor that would be easily detectable, even in a drunken state. Later rectifications imply that he may have been killed by crushed up mothballs dissolved in whiskey instead. When offered to him, of course he accepted because he enjoyed alcohol. However, the bartender told him not to drink a drink that hasn't been poured in front of him, slapping the drink out of his hand. Robert Johnson, infuriated, yelled at the bartender, telling him never to do that again, and graciously accepted another drink offered by the same person, which was also theorized to be poisoned. Whatever the cause of death was, it's unfortunate that he died so young, and it is definitely looking like there was some kind of foul play involved. He was buried in Morgan City, Mississippi, or at least he says he was. There's also some different accounts on how that happened. However, that's the one most people generally agree on. As for who he influenced, or who he's influenced by, famous artists Skip Jones, Lonnie Johnson, and like I said, the aforementioned Ike Zimmerman was probably the biggest influence on him. However, his influence reached a much grander scope, reaching artists like Keith Richards, Brian Jones, Robert Plant, Eric Clapton, who spoke very highly of him, and Bob Dylan, all legends in their own respect. So, all in all, Robert Johnson was a pioneer of rock and roll and the blues, having a great amount of influence in affecting many's lives. Whether he made a deal to get his talent or not, he still had a bunch of it, and he was a great person, from what it seems, as most people account him as a nice and friendly man, and very intelligent, yet a little bashful, and he will always remain a legend in the scheme of rock and roll. That's all for today's episode. Thank you guys for listening. Let me know if you have some artists you'd like me to review in the future. But have a good day, and goodbye.